Step out of the car now. The officer's voice sliced through the quiet East Bridge precinct parking lot. Like a knife she turned, calm but unwavering, standing beside her unmarked sedan. She blended into the night, her plain clothes betraying none of the authority she held. "I'm authorized to be here," she said evenly. Her eyes met his. But he was not listening. His hand hovered near his holster. "Do not argue with me. Step back, or I'll make you." His words dripped with hostility, thick as oil in the damp air. Raising one hand, she tried to de-escalate. "You do not want to do this. Just let me." Too late. His movements were sharp, driven by something more than protocol. A shove, fast and brutal, sent her reeling against the car. "People like you do not belong here," he growled, her breath caught. "People like you." It was not the first time she'd heard it, but familiarity did not dull the sting. Humiliation flared hot and relentless, burning deeper than the ache in her back. Straightening, she brushed the dust from her jacket. Her eyes locked onto his. "What did you just say?" Her voice was soft, yet the edges cut like glass. "I said you do not belong here. Now leave before I call backup." His sneer widened, condescension oozing from every word. He stood tall, wrapped in the brittle confidence of misplaced power. Then she did something that shattered his confidence entirely. Her hand slipped into her coat pocket. His gaze snapped to her fingers, his own hand twitching toward his side arm. But no gun appeared. It was something far more dangerous to him. A badge, gold and gleaming, beneath the flicker of the overhead lights. Chief of Police. The blood drained from his face. For a moment he was rooted to the ground, unable to reconcile the truth. Standing in front of him, she stepped forward, her voice calm but sharp as ice. "Let me explain something to you," she said, her words slicing through the thick quiet. "I do not answer to you. In fact, you answer to me." Silence swallowed them whole. His mouth opened, but the words fumbled, tripping over each other in a desperate attempt to find footing. "Do you even know who I am?" she asked, her voice quiet but steel-edged. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" He stammered. Nothing coherent followed. The weight of his arrogance, once wielded so easily, now hung from his shoulders like chains. That night was the beginning. No one saw what came next. His fate and hers were now tied in ways neither could predict. The humiliation he cast without thought was destined to spiral back toward him, but not in the way anyone expected. Because what awaited him was not punishment. It was a lesson that would shake the very foundation of his beliefs, about power, about respect, and about justice. But how does a single act of blind prejudice unravel into a confrontation that rocks an entire department to its core? What does justice look like when the tables turn so violently? Stay with us. because this is a story you need to hear to believe. Welcome to Turning Point Stories. Before we dive deeper into today's powerful tale, I want to take a moment to speak to anyone who's faced injustice, discrimination, or doubt. At Turning Point, we believe storytelling holds power. The power to spotlight hard truths, honor resilience, and inspire change. If stories of perseverance and justice move you, make sure to subscribe and become part of our growing community. Now settle in. This is a story you will not want to miss. The air in the East Bridge Precinct parking lot was thick still, carrying the faint scent of rain from earlier that evening. Overhead lights flickered, casting long shadows across cracked pavement. This part of the city was a collision of ambition and desperation. Power lingered here in sideways glances. In unspoken rules, it was not the prettiest precinct, but it was hers. Chief Mayor Caldwell wore authority like armor. At 45, she was East Bridge's first black woman to lead the department, a position she earned through grit, unrelenting determination, and sharp intellect. Her rise had not been smooth. She'd faced resistance at every step. Quiet hostility, the kind of barriers that never shouted, but whispered persistently enough to slow progress. But Maya was no stranger to adversity. Raised by her grandmother in the heart of Baltimore, Maya learned early that fairness was not handed out freely. If she wanted respect, she had to demand it, build it brick by brick. Her path in law enforcement was far from typical. She started as a beat cop, taking late-night shifts, patrolling streets that mirrored her childhood. Her talent for reading people, understanding fear, and motivation made her an exceptional officer. Her ability to diffuse volatile situations earned her respect from the community, but not from everyone. Maya's sharp instincts and relentless drive drew jealousy from colleagues who had grown comfortable in mediocrity. She rose too fast, too bold, and too unwilling to play along with the old games. Her promotion to chief was bittersweet. For every cheer of victory, there were murmurs behind closed doors. She was not just a woman in power. She was their boss, and some were not ready for it. One of those men was Ethan Granger, a 15-year veteran of the East Bridge PD. Ethan had carved out a reputation as a hardliner. At 39, he thrived on control. Policing was not about empathy for Ethan. It was about dominance. He resented Maya. From the moment she stepped into leadership, her calm authority unsettled him. Her refusal to let things slide infuriated him. He believed the badge meant power, not service. But that night in the parking lot, Ethan learned just how fragile that power could be. Maya Caldwell's promotion to chief was not just her victory. It stood for every woman and person of color who had been told they did not belong. But with the honor came the inevitable backlash. Some of the older officers barely hid their discontent. To them, Maya was an outsider, an exception to the system. Not a part of it, a system designed to protect them. Not to be challenged by someone like her. And challenge them she did. One officer felt the challenge more than most. Ethan Granger, a 15-year veteran of the East Bridge PD. Ethan had joined fresh out of the academy, eager to prove himself by 39. He carried the reputation of a hardliner, someone who believed policing was about control, not connection. Ethan dismissed concepts like de-escalation as unnecessary to him. Political correctness was a weakness. The badge represented power, and he wielded it accordingly. And he did not like being questioned, least of all by Maya. His disdain was not overt. Ethan was too calculated for that. It seeped through in smaller ways. Ignoring directives, slipping sarcastic comments into meetings, dragging his feet on tasks he did not like. Maya noticed, of course. She noticed everything, but she had learned long ago that some battles needed patience. Ethan was not her biggest problem. Not yet. The night of the incident started like any other. Maya stayed late, sifting through endless reports and budget forms. Administrative work was not why she had pursued leadership, but it was part of the job. Leadership was not glamorous. It was exhausting by the time she stepped outside. The parking lot was nearly deserted, save for a few squad cars under buzzing street lights. She planned to leave unnoticed quietly. But fate had other plans. Ethan was returning from patrol, irritations simmering beneath his skin. He had spent the night handling a noise complaint in one of East Bridge's wealthier districts, a task he considered beneath him. As he crossed the lot, his eyes narrowed. There, standing by an unmarked car in plain clothes, was a figure he did not recognize. His assumptions filled in the blanks. Ethan prided himself on spotting trouble, and in his eyes Maya, dressed casually leaning against the car, did not belong. Maybe it was her appearance. Maybe it was something deeper. "Hey you!" He barked, his voice slicing through the quiet. Maya glanced over her shoulder. Calm but alert, she recognized him immediately. Ethan did not recognize her. "Yes," she replied, her fingers casually resting on the door handle. "This area is restricted. You cannot be here." Ethan's posture shifted, his chest puffing out with the authority he thought he wielded. Maya arched an eyebrow. "I work here," she said, nodding toward the building. But Ethan was not listening. His mind raced ahead, slotting her into a category she did not belong in. Maybe she was lying, maybe the car was not hers. He'd heard stories of break-ins, thieves pretending to be staff. "Step away from the vehicle," Ethan ordered, his tone hardening. Maya's patience wore thin. "Excuse me, do not play games with me." Ethan stepped closer, jaw tight. "I said step away from the car." She did not move. Her calm exterior masked the rising irritation, bubbling just beneath the surface. "Officer Granger," she said quietly, "you're making a mistake. but Ethan did not hear her. Or maybe he did not care. The shove came quick and hard. Maya staggered against the car, catching herself before she fell. For a heartbeat, everything stopped. The weight of what he had just done, settling over them both, straightening. She fixed him with a stare colder than the night air. That she said, brushing dust from her sleeve, was the second mistake you made tonight. Ethan's eyes narrowed. Second. He repeated, doubt flickering beneath his bravado. Maya reached into her pocket. His hand jerked instinctively toward his holster, but there was no weapon. Instead, she held something that sent ice through his veins. A badge. The gold emblem glinted under the flickering lights. Chief of Police. The blood drained from his face. Ethan stumbled back a step, his confidence crumbling beneath the weight of what stood in front of him. Maya did not need to say another word. She did not have to. The shift in power was instant and irreversible. For the first time in Ethan's career, he felt small, but this was not the end. The fallout from that night would ripple through Eastbridge PD, exposing fractures long hidden beneath the surface. For Maya, it was a moment to assert her authority, a reminder that her leadership was not just earned, it was necessary. For Ethan, it marked the beginning of a reckoning he had not seen coming. This was not just about a single confrontation. It was about the foundations beneath them, both shaking. And neither of them realized how much further the ground was going to break. Maya Caldwell sat in her office. Long after the precinct had gone quiet, stacks of files littered her desk. Every complaint, every infraction, every incident linked to Ethan Granger's career. This was not just about one shove in a parking lot. This was about every officer who had been silenced, every report that had been brushed aside, because Granger knew the right people. By the time the review panel convened, the weight in the air was palpable. At one end of the long table, Ethan sat flanked by his union representative, his posture stiff, his expression caught between defiance and something that looked uncomfortably like fear. Maya sat at the opposite end, calm and unflinching. The panel of 5 sat between them. 2 senior officers, a city council member, and 2 external review officials. In the center, Captain Theresa Barnes. The panel chair sat straight-backed, known for her sharp mind and intolerance for theatrics. When the hearing began, Granger's representative wasted no time, painting him as a victim. The defense was predictable. A hard-working officer, unfairly targeted by an overzealous chief, with an agenda. Mistruths and misdirection colored every word. Maya sat silently, hands folded, waiting for her moment. When it came, she did not hesitate. She laid it all out. The footage, the reports, the testimonies, one by one. Each piece of evidence chipped away at the facade Ethan had constructed over the years. There was no need for embellishment. The truth was damning enough. But even as Maya spoke, She could feel the resistance around her. Some panel members shifted in their seats, their discomfort evident. This was not just about Ethan. It was about the system that had protected him. And they were part of that system. When the session neared its end, Maya's gaze drifted to Ethan. "This is not about me, Officer Granger," she said, her voice level but piercing. "This is about what kind of department we want to be. Do we stand by the values we claim to uphold? Or do we protect those who tarnish them?" The room fell silent, her words lingering long after they had settled. But Maya knew the fight was not over. The panel deliberated for hours. Maya sat at the far end of the waiting area, her hands clasped, the hum of fluorescent lights filling the space. Every detail of the hearing replayed in her mind. At the opposite end, Ethan paced, agitation curling through his every movement. His representative, a worry man with thinning hair, sat back trying to appear relaxed. "But failing, you think they'll side with her?" Ethan asked, voice low and sharp. The man shrugged. "The footage does not help us. And the complaints, it's a lot to explain away." Ethan stopped pacing, turning on him. His jaw tightened. "She wants to ruin me." He spat. "That's what this is. I did not play along like everyone else." His representative sighed. "Look, Ethan, if they offer you a deal, take it. Admit the mistake. Agree to some training, and you might keep your pension." Ethan's face twisted. "Admit I was wrong to her." His voice dripped venom. "You think I'm going to sit there and let her win?" Before the man could respond, the doors to the panel room creaked open. Darren Marino stepped out, his face unreadable. "They're ready," he said simply. Maya stood, smoothing her blazer as she passed Ethan. She felt his glare burn into her back. She did not look him. The room was cold and tense as Maya and Ethan took their seats. Captain Barnes wasted no time. "Thank you for your patience," she began, her tone grave. "After reviewing all evidence and hearing from both sides, we have deliberated extensively. This matter is not just about the incident itself, but the broader implications for the department." Maya's heart pounded, though her face betrayed nothing. Barnes turned to Ethan. "Officer Granger, your actions in the parking lot were not only a clear violation of protocol, but a blatant display of disrespect toward your superior officer. Your refusal to de-escalate and your unnecessary use of force reflect poorly on your judgment and character." Ethan shifted in his seat, his fists clenching beneath the table. Barnes continued, her gaze hardening. "What concerns this panel even more is the pattern of behavior that has come to light during this investigation. Complaints of excessive force, discriminatory remarks. These are not isolated incidents. Officer Granger, they reveal a troubling trend." Ethan shot to his feet, his face flushed. "This is a setup," he barked. "She's been gunning for me since the day she walked in here." "Sit down," Barnes said coldly, not bothering to raise her voice. Ethan hesitated, seething, but eventually dropped into his seat. Maya watched, expression calm. Chief Caldwell Barnes continued, turning to her. Your commitment to accountability is noted and commendable. However, this panel must also consider the morale and stability of the department. Maya's stomach tightened. Ethan's eyes flickered with faint hope. Officer Granger Barnes concluded, this panel recommends immediate suspension without pay, pending further training and review. Any future infractions will result in termination. Maya's fingers tightened around the table's edge. It was not enough across from her. Ethan leaned back in his chair, a faint smirk curling at the corners of his mouth. As the session ended, Maya rose to leave. But before stepping away, she turned to Captain Barnes. With respect, Captain, Maya said quietly but firmly, this recommendation falls short. Officer Granger's actions are not just personal failings. They represent a culture we cannot afford to tolerate. If we allow him to remain, we send a message that this behavior is acceptable. Barnes met her gaze but said nothing. The decision was final, but Maya was not done. As Ethan left the room, he shot her a sidelong glance. Nice speech, he muttered. Too bad it did not work. Maya's eyes did not waver. You're right about one thing, Granger, she said, her voice quiet but sharp. This is not over. Ethan's smirk faltered as she stepped past him. Because Maya Caldwell was not interested in winning battles. She was ready to tear down the entire war. It's a setup, Ethan, Granger barked, his face flushed red with anger. She's had it out for me since the day she got here. This whole thing is personal, and you're playing right into her hands. Sit down, Captain, Theresa Barnes snapped, her tone leaving no room for argument. Ethan's chest heaved, but after a tense moment, he dropped back into his chair, muttering under his breath. Barnes turned her attention to Mayor Caldwell. Chief Caldwell, you've presented a compelling case, and your commitment to accountability is commendable. But this panel must also consider the potential impact of our decision on department morale. Maya's stomach tightened, though her expression remained impassive. She knew where this was heading. Officer Granger Barnes continued, shifting her gaze. This panel recommends immediate suspension without pay, pending mandatory de-escalation, training, and further review. Any future violations will result in termination. Maya's chest burned suspension. It was not enough Ethan had shoved her in plain view, undermined her authority, and endangered others for years. A suspension felt like a tap on the wrist. Across the room, Ethan leaned back, the faintest smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. To him it was a victory. Thank you for your time, Barnes concluded, signaling the end of the session. As the panel members began gathering their documents, Maya remained seated. Captain Barnes, she said, her voice steady. Barnes looked up, her expression wary. Go ahead, Chief. Maya stepped forward, facing the panel with unwavering calm. With all due respect, this recommendation is not enough to address the systemic issues within this department. Officer Granger's actions are not isolated. They reflect a culture that tolerates disrespect, discrimination, and abuse of power. If we allow this to continue, we fail not only ourselves, but the community we serve. The room stilled. Even Ethan's smirk faded slightly. His eyes narrowing. Maya continued, her voice unwavering. This is not about vengeance. It's about integrity. If Officer Granger stays, we send a message to every officer who looks up to him, and every citizen who looks to us for protection, that this behavior is acceptable. Barnes studied her for a long moment before offering a slight nod. Your point is noted, Chief Caldwell, but this panel's decision is final. Maya inclined her head, a storm brewing quietly behind her eyes. She gathered her things and left the room. Without another word, outside in the hallway, footsteps echoed behind her. Nice speech. Ethan's voice dripped with sarcasm. Too bad it did not work. Maya stopped, turning slowly. Her gaze met his with piercing intensity. You think this is over? She asked quietly. It looks over to me. Ethan smirked. Maya stepped closer, her voice low and cutting. You're right about one thing. This is not personal, but mark my words, Granger. Your time hiding behind that badge is running out. And when it does, you'll understand what accountability really looks like. With that, she walked away, leaving him standing alone, his smirk fading as her words lingered. The next morning, the precinct buzzed with uneasy energy. Maya could feel the tension with every step. Conversations hushed as she passed, officers exchanging quick glances. Some nodded respectfully, others avoided eye contact. She'd expected this. Resistance was heavier than she anticipated. But she kept her head high, her posture unyielding in her office. She sifted through reports until Darren Marino stepped in, closing the door behind him. His expression was grim. We've got a problem, Darren said. Maya leaned back in her chair. Let me guess, Granger. Darren nodded. He's stirring the pot, talking to people, some of the younger officers, a couple of the veterans. He's spinning this as a vendetta. Says you're targeting him because of personal bias. Maya's jaw tightened. Personal bias? She repeated. He assaulted me on camera. I know, Darren said. But some of them believe him. They think you're making an example out of him. To make a statement. Maya exhaled slowly, forcing the frustration to settle beneath the surface. This is not about Granger, she said quietly. It's about accountability. If they can not see that they're part of the problem. Darren hesitated. He's not stopping there. Ward is. He's reaching out to the union. Even a couple of reporters. He's trying to spin the narrative before it gets away from him. Maya's eyes narrowed. Let him. If he wants to drag this into the public eye, I'll be ready. Darren gave her a long look. Just be careful. Chief Granger's not fighting for his job. He's fighting for his pride. And men like him do not go down quietly. That afternoon, Mayor called for a department-wide meeting. She stood at the front of the briefing room. As officers filtered in, the air was thick with anticipation. Ethan sat in the back row, arms crossed, smug as ever. Maya barely glanced at him. "This will not take long," Maya began, her voice strong and clear. "I wanted to address the elephant in the room." A murmur rippled through the crowd. "I'm aware that some of you feel I've been too harsh, that I'm overstepping." She paused, scanning the room. "Let me be clear, accountability is not optional. If we do not hold each other to the highest standard, how can we expect the public to trust us? How can we trust each other?" "Silence, this is not about politics or power. It's about integrity," she continued. "If anyone feels differently, my office door is open, but let me warn you. If you undermine this process, you'll face the same scrutiny as Officer Granger." Her gaze swept over the room, locking with Ethan's for a brief moment. His smirk had vanished when the meeting ended. Darren caught up to her as she stepped into the hall. "That was bold," he said. Maya's lips quirked into the faintest smile. "Bold is the only language some of them understand." The fight was not over, but Maya Caldwell was ready for it. Mayor Caldwell stood at the front of the briefing room, her gaze steady as officers filed in. Tension pressed into the space, thick and unspoken. Ethan Granger leaned against the back wall, arms crossed, his smirk faint but present. "I called this meeting," Maya began, her voice even but firm, "because it's time to address the elephant in the room." A low murmur rippled through the crowd, but she continued without pause. "We're at a crossroads as a department. One officer's actions have brought us here, but this moment is bigger than him. This is about who we are and what we stand for." Her eyes scanned the room, locking with those who dared meet her gaze. "I know some of you think I've been too harsh, that I'm overstepping." Maya's tone sharpened. "Let me be clear, accountability is not optional. If we cannot hold ourselves to the highest standards, how can we expect the community to trust us? How can we trust each other?" The room stilled. Even the faintest trace of Ethan's smirk faltered. "This is not about politics. This is not about race, it's about integrity. And if anyone has a problem with that, my office door is open." Maya let the silence settle, like a weight over the crowd. "But hear this, if you think you can undermine me, if you think you can ignore the values this department is supposed to uphold, you will find yourself under the same scrutiny as Officer Granger." The words hung in the air long after she stepped down. Back in her office, Maya leaned against her desk, resolve hardening. The meeting had shifted something, but not enough. She knew this battle was not over. Later that evening her inbox chimed. The subject line read "Request for comment." Officer Granger allegations. Maya's pulse quickened as she opened the email. Chief Caldwell, we've received allegations from Officer Ethan Granger regarding misconduct and bias within the department. He claims he is being unfairly targeted and has provided documents he says support his case. We would like to offer you the opportunity to respond. Before running our story, please let us know if you're available for an interview. Julia Keene, Eastbridge News. Maya's eyes narrowed as she reread the message. Ethan was making his move, and he was not holding back. The next day, Maya sat across from Julia Keene, a sharp-eyed journalist, known for her no-nonsense interviews. Cameras were set up in the precinct conference room. The tension hummed in the air. The questions began as expected. About Maya's career, the challenges she faced as the first black woman to lead the Eastbridge PD. She answered with grace, her voice calm and unwavering. But then Julia's tone shifted. Chief Caldwell. Julia began leaning in slightly. Officer Granger has accused you of unfairly targeting him due to personal bias, he claims. This incident reflects a broader pattern of hostility toward him and others like him. How do you respond? Maya did not flinch. I respond with facts, she said firmly. Officer Granger assaulted me in the precinct parking lot. That incident was captured on video. His actions were not only a violation of protocol, but a violation of the trust we are supposed to uphold. Julia pressed further. Granger claims you've held a vendetta against him since you became chief. He points to past disciplinary actions as evidence. Maya leaned forward slightly, her gaze unwavering. My vendetta, as he calls it, is a commitment to accountability. Every disciplinary action I've taken against Officer Granger has been documented and justified. If he feels targeted, it's because he's been allowed to operate without consequences for far too long. That stops under my leadership. In the break room, Ethan watched the interview unfold on the small TV. His face darkened as Maya's calm, unrelenting words echoed through the room. Beside him, Rick Downey shifted uneasily. She's tearing you apart, Rick muttered. Ethan's fists slammed onto the table. She thinks she's won, Ethan growled, his knuckles white. But this is not over. Rick hesitated. What are you gonna do? Ethan's eyes burned with quiet fury. Whatever it takes. The fallout from the interview was immediate. By morning, Maya's words had spread across social media and local news footage of her calm, but direct responses circulated rapidly. Some praised her as a leader, unafraid to challenge the system. Others sided with Ethan, framing Maya as a divisive figure, dismantling the department's traditional power structure. The precinct felt different. Conversations were shorter, glances sharper. But Maya walked the halls with her head high. She had faced worse storms before, and she would weather this one too. Meanwhile, Ethan was not retreating. With the backing of a local lawyer, Graham Vance, notorious for defending controversial figures, Ethan filed a formal complaint with the city council. The complaint accused Maya of discrimination, abuse of power, and creating a hostile work environment. It was filled with exaggerations and half-truths. But it was enough to force the city into action. A new review panel was convened. This time focused on Maya. Maya sat in her office, the letter from the city council still resting on her desk. The weight of it pressed heavy in her chest. Across from her, Darren Marino watched quietly. "You've seen it?" he asked, nodding toward the letter. Maya's voice was calm but tight. "I've seen it," Darren sighed. Leaning forward, Granger's escalating. "This is not just about him anymore. They're using him as a pawn to push back against you." Maya folded her arms, leaning back in her chair. "Let them try, Chief." Darren's voice softened. "They're not going to play fair. They'll dig into everything. Every disciplinary action. Every report you filed. They'll twist it to fit their narrative." Maya's eyes met his. "I know." He hesitated before nodding. "So what's the plan?" Maya's expression hardened. "We keep moving forward." Maya Caldwell sat alone in her office. The letter from the city council still pressed between her fingers. The words blurred as frustration boiled beneath the surface. Ethan Granger's formal complaint against her accused Maya of abuse of power, discrimination, and fostering a hostile work environment. It was desperate, riddled with exaggerations and half-truths. But it was enough to force the city to act. A new review panel had been convened, tasked with investigating the department and placing Maya under intense scrutiny. Maya exhaled, pressing her palms against the desk to ground herself. She had expected resistance, but Ethan's willingness to burn the department down around him caught her off guard. A knock pulled her from her thoughts. Darren Marino stepped inside, his expression grim. "You've seen it?" he asked, nodding toward the letter. Maya nodded, her voice clipped. "I've seen it," Darren sighed, easing into the seat across from her. "They're escalating, Chief. This is not about Granger anymore. He's just a pawn. They're using him to dismantle everything you've built." Maya leaned back, her eyes drifting to the ceiling for a brief moment, before locking on to Darren's. "Let them try," she said firmly. "I will not let this department fall back into old habits. Not without a fight." Darren hesitated. "Chief," he said carefully, "this panel is not going to play fair. They're going to dig into everything. Every decision you've made. Every officer you disciplined. They'll twist it to fit their narrative." Maya's eyes narrowed. "I've done my job with integrity," she said quietly. "If they want to question that, I'll answer." But deep down, she knew Darren was right. The truth did not matter to them. The day of the first hearing arrived. and tension hung thick in the packed room. City officials, reporters and members of the public filled the seats. Maya sat at the long table. Calm but unreadable across from her sat the panel. A mix of city council members and external investigators. Ethan Granger sat beside his lawyer. Graham Vance, smug and upright. Vance wasted no time painting Ethan as a victim. "He's a veteran officer," Vance said smoothly, addressing the panel. "Dedicated, loyal, and now targeted by a chief intent on making him a scapegoat. This is personal, nothing more." Maya listened silently, hands folded in front of her. When her turn came, she rose, her voice quiet but powerful. "I'm not here to defend myself." She began, meeting each panel member's gaze. "I'm here to defend the principles. This department should stand for accountability, integrity, and respect. Those values apply to every officer, including myself." She walked the panel through the events leading up to the parking lot confrontation, detailing Ethan's misconduct and disciplinary record. She presented reports, witness statements, and formal complaints, each piece of evidence stripping away Ethan's defense, one layer at a time. But as Maya spoke, she could feel the undercurrent of resistance. Some panel members shifted uncomfortably, their skepticism clear finally. One of them, a sharp-eyed councilman named Richard Hale, leaned forward. "Chief Caldwell," Hale said, his tone pointed, "some might say your leadership style has been divisive. How do you respond to those who feel your actions have eroded morale within the department?" Maya did not blink. "Change is uncomfortable, councilman. But discomfort is not the same as divisiveness. Morale suffers when misconduct is ignored. When officers see their peers operating without accountability." She let the silence hang for a moment before continuing. "Addressing those problems makes some people uncomfortable. That's the cost of leadership. My job is not to make everyone comfortable. It's to lead with integrity." The room stilled, the weight of her words settling over the crowd. Even Ethan shifted slightly, his confidence wavering for just a moment. The hearing continued, but Maya's calm never faltered. She answered each question with clarity, standing firm, even when the panel's biases seeped through. But as the day wore on, it became clear the battle was far from over. Later that night, Maya returned home. Exhausted but determined, she sat at her kitchen table, poring over notes for the next day's hearing. Her phone buzzed. "Darren, check your email, you'll want to see this." Curious, Maya opened her laptop. Her breath caught as she scrolled through the anonymous message. Attached were documents, emails, and internal memos. Evidence of collusion within the department. Senior officers had been protecting Ethan Granger and others like him for years. Complaints had been buried, disciplinary records altered to shield them from consequences. It was the smoking gun she needed. With this, Maya could do more than clear her name. She could expose the deeper corruption, threatening the entire department. The next morning, Maya walked into the hearing with renewed confidence. When her turn to speak came, she rose holding the stack of documents. "I have additional evidence to present to this panel," she said, calmly passing the papers to each member. As they read, murmurs broke out around the room. "These documents," Maya continued, "reveal a pattern of misconduct, stretching beyond Officer Granger. Senior officers within this department have systematically protected individuals like him. Complaints were buried, records manipulated." The panel shifted, exchanging uneasy glances. "This is not just about Ethan Granger." Maya pressed, her voice rising. "This is about a culture that thrives on silence and loyalty at the expense of justice. If we allow it to continue, we fail not only this department, but the community we serve." Ethan's lawyer flipped through the documents furiously. Vance leaned in to whisper something to Ethan, but Granger's face was pale. His confidence shattered. Maya's gaze swept across the room, landing briefly on Ethan. "The evidence is clear," she said, "and it's time we stop protecting those who undermine the badge they wear." Silence fell as the weight of her words settled over the room. The fight was not over, but the tide had shifted. Maya Caldwell stood at the front of the hearing room, her gaze unyielding, as the final pages of damning evidence settled into the hands of the panel. A low hum of whispers rippled through the space, the weight of her revelations sinking in. "These documents," Maya said, her voice steady but charged with emotion, "reveal a systemic failure within this department." Her eyes scanned the room, locking with each member of the panel. They show how misconduct has not just been tolerated, it's been protected at the highest levels. This is not just about Ethan Granger. It's about a culture that values loyalty over integrity, silence over accountability. The panel members exchanged uneasy glances, their confidence visibly shaken. Even Granger's lawyer, Graham Vance, leaned over to whisper furiously into Ethan's ear. Maya turned toward the audience, her voice rising with conviction. "If we want to rebuild trust with our community and with each other, we must confront these truths head-on. Ignoring them only lets the rot spread." The room stilled, the hearing adjourned shortly after, leaving behind an air of stunned silence. Reporters swarmed as Maya exited, microphones and cameras following her every move. She did not stop, her focus was sharp, her steps deliberate. The battle was not over, but for the first time in weeks, she felt hope stir in her chest. The truth was out, and now it could no longer be buried. Back at the precinct, the atmosphere shifted. Officers who had once openly criticized Maya now avoided her gaze, their bravado, once loud and unchecked, wilted under the weight of the evidence she had revealed. Ethan Granger's name was no longer just his burden. It was theirs. The department felt like a house of cards. And Maya was the wind threatening to bring it down. In her office, Maya sat across from Darren Moreno, exhaustion evident in her eyes. Between them sat a stack of new reports, evidence that stretched deeper than either of them expected. "This is bigger than we thought," Darren muttered, flipping through the files. "These are not just cover-ups, Chief. Some of these officers have been acting like they're untouchable." He paused, holding up one of the documents. "And Granger, he's not just a pawn in this. He's been protected for years." Maya rubbed her temple, the weight of the past few weeks pressing down on her. "We cannot let this slide," she said quietly. "If we do, everything I've fought for means nothing. This department needs to be rebuilt from the ground up." Darren hesitated, his voice softening. "Rebuilding means tearing it all down first," he said carefully. "You know what kind of backlash that will bring, right?" Maya nodded, her jaw tightening. "I know, but it's the only way." Before Darren could respond, a knock echoed at the door. Maya straightened, instinctively guarded. "Come in." The door opened slowly, and Ethan Granger stepped inside. Darren's hand hovered over the files in front of him, but Maya raised a hand, signaling him to wait. Ethan's usual bravado was gone. He shifted awkwardly, his hands shoved into his pockets. "I need to talk to you," he said quietly, his voice lacking its usual edge. Maya exchanged a glance with Darren before nodding. "Fine talk." Ethan's eyes flickered to the floor as he spoke. "I saw the documents you turned over at the hearing," he said. "The emails, the complaints. I did not know it went that deep." Maya arched an eyebrow. "You did not know?" she asked pointedly. "Or you did not want to know?" Ethan flinched but did not argue. "Maybe both," he admitted. I thought the system worked for me, because I was doing things the right way. But now," he swallowed hard, his voice thick with something that almost sounded like regret. "Now I'm not so sure." Darren snorted under his breath, but Maya silenced him with a look. "Why are you here, Granger?" she asked, her tone softening only slightly. "What do you want from me?" Ethan hesitated, his eyes lingering on the floor for a long moment. Finally he looked up. "I need to make this right." Maya's eyes narrowed. "Make it right? You spent weeks trying to tear me down, trying to destroy my reputation. And now you want redemption." Ethan's shoulders sagged, the weight of her words settling heavily over him. "I did not come to make excuses," he said quietly. "I came because I cannot keep pretending. I'm not part of the problem. If you're going to fix this department, I want to help." Darren leaned forward, skeptical. "Why should we trust you?" he asked bluntly. "You fought this every step of the way." Ethan met Darren's gaze, his voice bitter but honest. "Because I've got nothing left to lose," he replied. "The hearing did not fire me outright, but I will not have a career here. My name is dirt, no matter what happens." The least I can do is use what I know to fix this mess. Maya studied him carefully, her expression unreadable. The room felt heavier, the tension stretching between them. Finally she spoke. "If you're serious about this," she said quietly, "there's no going back." Ethan nodded, his posture stiff but resolute. "I know." Maya leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. "Then let's get to work." Maya Caldwell leaned back in her chair, studying Ethan Granger carefully. "You realize what this means," she said quietly. "You'll be testifying against your own colleagues, exposing the system that protected you. Are you ready for that?" Ethan hesitated, but then nodded. His face betrayed the fear he tried to suppress. "I'm ready," Maya exhaled slowly, holding his gaze. "Then let's get to work." The days that followed were relentless. Ethan provided names, dates, and internal details that Maya's team meticulously cross-referenced with the evidence she had already uncovered. The deeper they dug, the more rot surfaced. Officers had fabricated reports, manipulated evidence, and intimidated witnesses. What began as a battle between Maya and Ethan had become a full-scale investigation into the entire department. Ethan's cooperation did not go unnoticed. Some officers distanced themselves from him, while others were not so subtle. One afternoon Ethan stepped into the locker room when Rick Downey blocked his path. "What the hell are you doing, Granger?" Rick's voice was low and tight with anger. Ethan met his glare calm but wary. "Telling the truth, Rick. If you've got a problem with that, maybe you're part of the problem too." Rick's jaw tensed, but he said nothing. After a long, heavy pause, he stepped aside. The tension followed Ethan out the door. Meanwhile, Maya prepared for the next hearing, knowing the stakes had never been higher. Late one evening, as she sat in her office reviewing notes, Darren Marino knocked lightly at the door. "You need to see this," he said, handing her a thin folder. Maya opened it, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the contents. Inside were leaked memos from the city council. Certain council members had been quietly working to discredit her. They had fed stories to the press, painting her as divisive and tyrannical. "They're scared," Darren said softly. "You're threatening their status quo, and they're hitting back." Maya closed the folder, setting it aside. "Let them," she said. "I've got the truth on my side." Darren smirked faintly. "I figured you'd say that." The day of the hearing arrived. The room was packed once again, filled with officers, officials, and reporters, eager to witness the next chapter of the unfolding scandal. Maya and Ethan sat at the same table, an unlikely alliance that drew curious glances from across the room. As Maya presented the new evidence, the murmurs grew louder. The leaked memos, emails, and testimonies painted a damning portrait of a department long plagued by corruption and cover-ups. But it was Ethan's testimony that sealed the case. His detailed accounts exposed internal schemes, falsified reports, and the unspoken rules that had protected certain officers. For years, when the hearing concluded, Maya stood facing the panel. Her voice was steady but charged with emotion. "This is our chance to be better. To do better," she said. "If we do not take it, we are not just failing ourselves. We're failing the people we swore to serve." The room fell silent, her words sinking in. As the panel deliberated, Maya and Ethan sat in the waiting area. "You think they'll listen?" Ethan asked, his voice uncertain. Maya's eyes lingered on the closed doors of the panel room. "I think they'll have no choice," she replied. The decision came swiftly, and it was monumental. Faced with the irrefutable evidence, the panel ruled in Maya's favor, issuing a sweeping mandate for immediate reforms. High-ranking officers implicated in the cover-ups were suspended, pending further investigation. As for Ethan Granger, his fate was sealed. He resigned quietly, forfeiting his badge and ending his career in law enforcement. But his testimony had been pivotal in dismantling the network of corruption. Though it could not erase his past actions, it gave him a path to redemption, one he never expected to need. Maya stood tall as the ruling was read aloud, her heart pounding. The vindication was not just personal, it was symbolic. She had fought not just for herself, but for the integrity of the badge, and for those who believed that justice, no matter how slow, was worth pursuing. After the hearing, Ethan approached her, his steps slower, his posture awkward. For a long moment they stood in silence, the weight of their shared history between them. "I guess this is it," Ethan said finally, his voice low. Maya's gaze did not waver. "It does not erase what you did," she replied evenly, "but what you've done since it mattered." Ethan nodded, swallowing hard. "I've got a lot to figure out, a lot to fix. You'll have the time to do that now," Maya said. "Use it wisely." Ethan offered a faint, almost hopeful smile before turning and walking away. Maya watched him go, feeling an odd sense of closure. He was not her adversary anymore, but he was not her ally either. He was just a man who had faced his demons and chosen the harder path. Back at the precinct, the mood shifted towards quiet upheaval. The officers who had supported Granger kept their heads down. Those who had remained silent now watched Maya with newfound respect. The landscape was changing, and though the department's transformation had just begun, Maya knew progress had been set in motion. In the weeks following the hearing, the air inside the East Bridge PD shifted. The officers who once rallied behind Ethan Granger now kept their heads down, their confidence rattled by the wave of reforms Maya Caldwell had set in motion. Others approached her directly, quietly offering words of respect, their actions signaling a slow but tangible shift. Change was not immediate, but it was happening. Darren Marino stepped into her office one afternoon, his posture lighter than it had been in months. So he said, dropping into the chair across from her. "What's next, Chief?" Maya leaned back, a rare smile tugging at her lips. "We rebuild," she said. "Brick by brick." Darren chuckled. "I figured you'd say that the reforms began swiftly. Training programs were overhauled. New accountability policies were rolled out, and community leaders were invited to take part in shaping the future of the department." Maya led the charge with quiet but unwavering determination. The road ahead was long and fraught with resistance, but she knew every step was worth it. Months later, the department held a ceremony, honoring officers who had gone above and beyond in service to their community. Maya stood at the podium, the crowd falling silent as she began to speak. "Change is not easy," she said, her voice calm but resolute. "But it's necessary. Together, we've taken the first steps toward becoming the department this city deserves. There's still work to do, but I know we're on the right path." Applause rippled through the crowd, loud and genuine, as Maya stepped down. She caught sight of familiar faces, officers who had once doubted her, now standing with her. It was a moment she would carry with her for the rest of her career. Ethan Granger's path, though different, was no less significant. He had lost everything, but in that loss he found clarity. Leaving Eastbridge behind, Ethan started fresh in a quiet town, where he worked with at-risk youth, teaching them about choices, consequences, and accountability. It was not the career he envisioned, but it was work that mattered, a kind of penance he could live with. As for Maya Caldwell, she continued to lead with integrity and courage, becoming a symbol of hope and progress. Her story was no longer just about personal triumph. It was about resilience, the power of standing firm in the face of adversity. It was about rebuilding, not just for herself, but for the officers who came after her, for the community that watched, hoping for something better. And now it's your turn. What would you have done in Maya's position? Could you have stood as tall under the weight of such pressure? And what about Ethan? Does his redemption resonate with you? Or do you believe he should have faced harsher consequences? These are the questions stories like this leave behind. Life is not always black and white. It's messy, complicated, and often unfair. But what matters most is how we respond to those challenges, how we hold ourselves and others accountable, and how we strive to make things better, not just for ourselves but for the people around us. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think, share your thoughts. And if you enjoyed this journey, do not forget to subscribe for more stories that challenge, surprise, and inspire.